Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here tonight, for joining us for our event. I'll just start by saying a few words about the Macedonian Society of Great Britain, and then, of course, move forward with our main event of the night. For those of you who may be new to the Society or you haven't attended any events in the past, the Macedonian Society of Great Britain was founded in 1989 and is a registered charity in the UK. It's dedicated basically to the promotion of the Macedonian history, culture and heritage. It's the main organization in the UK that informs and educates the public, not just the Greek public, but the general public of Macedonia, its history and heritage that are Hellenic. The Society tends to organize a few times throughout the year lectures and presentations like the one we're hosting here tonight, in order basically to keep alive our identity and focus and bring together the Greek community of Great Britain. So the event tonight, titled Big Bang, a Forgotten Culture Boom in Greece, 1970-1973, is an illustrated lecture by Professor Stathis Kalivas, who will present the striking quality and quantity of cultural flourish in Greece between 1970 and 1973 under the Greek junta. A worthy representative of this culture boom is the late Dionysis Savvopoulos, who sadly passed yesterday. Professor Kalivas does not need an introduction. He didn't even want one when I asked him tonight, but he will get one. So Stathis Kalyvas is a professor of government at All Souls College at Oxford. He has a plethora of publications and books, mainly, of course, on politics, political violence and its history. He's the recipient of several awards, like the Woodrow Wilson Award, the Lubert Award, and the European Academy of Sociology Book Award. And of course, he attends lectures, events, presentations, both in Europe as well as in the US. So without further delay, I will pass the torch over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming tonight. Let me say a few things about this topic before I get into it. On the one hand, I'm very happy to be here. This is the very, very first presentation on this project. It's a project that I've worked on jointly with Natasha Triantafylou, who is here, for the best of the last 2 years. It's a project that started many projects as a very small project and eventually grew, and I'll tell you more about it and about its outcome. At the same time, I'm very sad because, as was just mentioned, Dionysis Savvopoulos is a very central figure in what I'm going to discuss tonight, passed away last night, which was a shock, not just to me, but many people who grew up with his music and his presence. But on top of it, I would say having worked on his life and his work for the last 2 years, and was actually last night, before I learned about it, I was proofreading the part of the book which is about him, and that made it particularly poignant. And so I'm very much under that shock. But I think it gives us the opportunity to revisit this period. And one of the things that I noticed today in a lot of the eulogies about his life, this is a period that is a bit missing. Whereas it's a really central part of his artistic career and in his creative process. So, what is the story? What is the Big Bang about? The title essentially points to the argument, which is an argument that sounds very counterintuitive, and I'm going to explain why, by giving you the motivation for this embark on that project and what is the point of it. In general, I would say it is pretty uncontroversial to say that the period that covers the dictatorship, the Greek dictatorship between April 1967 and July 1974 is seen very widely, and I think correctly so, in a very negative light. people emphasize, and that also contains the scholarly literature, emphasizes things like the repressive nature of the regime, the fact that dissenters and opposition figures were captured, tortured, the suppression of freedom, and also the fact that all of these factors together resulted in the destruction of cultural life. When someone mentions the two terms, culture and dictatorship, essentially the reaction one gets is a sense that this is about the efforts of the regime to present a sort of, in a very, I would say, crude way, to present its own propaganda under the light of culture, which has received extensive criticism, both during the dictatorship but by the opposition abroad of Greece, but also after its end. So the idea that there could be cultural life under the dictatorship is something that is not really discussed, which is what surprised us and what motivated us to begin this project. Very often the term that you see in writings about this period when it comes to culture is the description of cultural life during the dictatorship as a desert, essentially as a black hole. There wasn't much, and it's not a topic that really is associated with the study or even the perception of the dictatorship. To just give you a sense of that perception, there is a nice poster from a very nice exhibition that took place last year in Athens, organized by the Cultural Institute of the National Bank of Greece, the National Broadcaster, and the National Archives of Greece, which presented essentially the picture, the cultural picture of the period, as essentially a clash between the efforts of the regime to depict and present its ideals in a variety of different ways, and also a sort of resistance culture against the regime. But essentially, the axis of all the cultural life is the regime and its activity. And I think the poster is very nice because it shows you in a very, I think, powerful way the perception that exists today about this period as a perception, as a period that is uniformly very bleak. And essentially, you can think of the sort of common perception as of that period as a period in which things were, as I said, consistently terrible. But the question is it right to think about the period as consistently and uniformly bleak? So that's the motivating puzzle here. And of course, one has to ask a number of questions that are associated with this question. And I think the best way to sort of illustrate the puzzle that emerges once you enter into that area of research and you start looking at the actual culture is to contrast the poster that I just showed you, which has this very stark black and white gray element. And in fact, the entire exhibit was organized around this color scheme. Everything was very dark in the room. And you were really, you felt completely taken by, the strength of that color scheme, with pictures from the period, which depict the cultural life of the times. And I'm going to show you a picture from October 1969, which, and I have to say that this presentation was prepared before the news of the passing of Dionysius Savvopoulos, but this is the cover of his first important record during the dictatorship, October 1969. And what is very interesting about this picture is that it is exactly the opposite in terms of colors, in terms of the spirit that comes out of it, compared to the picture I just showed you before. It shows essentially an aesthetic which is very much related with the sort of hippie and psychedelic movement of the time, and also a picture that conveys a sense of optimism. And when you see pictures of the songs that were written for this record, which were performed in a very small nightclub in the center of Athens with a strange name, which was called Rodeo, very much coming from a Far West theme because it was a place that was initially created for American songs, located in the area of the Patission Boulevard. What you see is the same kind of vibe, if you want, in which the people who participate, who attend, exhibit a sense of a society that is very much into that kind of groove, that feels very much part of the main trends of the time, that participates in these kinds of concerts, and that has fun. So it's a very stark contrast with this idea of a time of incredible and overpowering sense of doom and fear. So that is the motivation. And the question is there a way to reconcile those two contrasting pictures? Because, as I'm going to argue, both existed at the same time. And is there a way to restore to our understanding of this period the sense of this cultural animation that existed within society? Of course, why would we want to do this? That is the overarching question. Certainly not to make the dictatorship look better than what it was, but to get a sense of the life during those times and the social and political dynamics of those times from a different perspective. But before I get to the question why do this, I think it makes a lot of sense to reformulate the original question in the following way. How was cultural life during that period? What forms did it take? How was it possible in the first place, given the various restrictions that existed? What were the main trends, the key characteristics of cultural life during that period? And so culture, I'm going to argue, is a very specific field of human activity that includes arts and letters, but at the same time also gives us the opportunity to understand broader social dynamics that we may otherwise miss, because culture both reflects and shapes behaviors, values, and all kinds of dynamics of social life. Now, as I said before, the standard assumption in the literature is that the Greek dictatorship essentially extinguished, and this is the term that is the verb that is very often used, cultural life in Greece, a cultural life that was actually in a period of bloom. The early 60s are associated, especially in the field of music, with the rise of the so-called new popular music of the time, the intervention primarily of Mikis Theodorakis and to an important extent of Manos Hatzidakis, but the combination of traditional forms of music, traditional instruments such as bouzouki, with new musical forms very much influenced by the West, but also taking their inspiration from the Rebetika song, and also lyrics that were coming from the biggest poets of Greece at the time, people like Seferis and Litis, Ritsos and others. This is a time that very often is referred to as the Renaissance of Greek culture, especially Greek music, and the dictatorship is seen as essentially a violent interruption of that process of blooming. And it's a belief that's dominant. You find it in the literature, you find it in perceptions, you find it in journalism, you find it in popular attitudes. I would say it is indeed overpowering. But the question is it true? Is it correct? And what if it is not? What does it tell us? So I'm going to focus in a way that is quite, is not going to go very much in depth because we don't have the time and opportunity to discuss every aspect of it, but I'm going to focus very much on arts and letters, and especially 5 different fields: the field of book publishing, fiction, poetry, etc., the field of theater, the field of cinema, the field of music, and then the field of arts, especially painting. I'm not going to say too much about it. I can tell you more in the Q&A if you want. And of course, I can give you much more information about it, about where to find more information. So essentially what I'm going to do through culture is take you and walk you through 4 key questions that I think are important questions to ask. The first is a descriptive question. What was the state of culture during the period of the dictatorship? Did culture die? Did it bloom? how much did it develop, which part of it developed, etc. The second question is, as I'm going to argue, that in fact culture did not die. On the contrary, it experienced a boom. Why? How was that possible? What were the reasons behind it? And related to that, how was culture related to politics, given that politics defines the nature of a lot of activities during that time? Last question, I think very important question. If culture indeed, as I'm going to argue, thrived during that time, why don't we know almost anything about it? Why do we believe exactly the opposite? What accounts for this divergence, in other words, between reality and perception? So let's begin with the descriptive part, which is the most difficult to present here because I'm not going to have the ability to do a multimedia presentation, even though my presentation was advertised as illustrated. I'm not going to play any music for you, unfortunately. The question is what? What was the state of culture during that period? And the first very important discovery one makes when one begins to study that period is that it is not a uniform period. There is a very important distinction between two broadly distinct subperiods. The first one is the period of the beginning of the dictatorship between 1967 and 1969. And this is the period which is associated with the introduction, for example, of the decree that forbade people from listening to the music of Mikis Theodorakis, that forbade a number of books from being published, a number of theater plays from being staged. It's a period of restrictions. It's also a period in which there is quite a lot of repression, especially the beginning of the dictatorship. The first week of the dictatorship, it is estimated that about 8,000 people were arrested in a sort of preemptive way so that the regime could establish its authority. And it's a period where I would say most people agree in general that there was a contraction of cultural life. So it's fairly clear. However, after 1969, things begin to change in a very dramatic way. And there are numbers of sort of signposts that signal this change. Some of them are driven from below. For example, the famous declaration by the poet and Nobel laureate George Seferis about the fact that the regime was illegitimate and was leading the country into a tragedy that really shook the regime and was a factor that led to the relaxation of various measures of control. But also, I would say more fundamentally, the regime had two other set of incentives that it responded to. One, it wanted to be seen abroad as a regime that was not too repressive, and that was a motivation for it to relax its controls. But also, it felt very safe because it had managed to completely eradicate any form of opposition within the country. It had managed to suppress various forms of resistance, which were primarily isolated, and it had managed to fill and also defeat a counter coup organized by the king in 1969. There was a feeling that it was safe. The initial perception that many people had in 1968, for example, that the regime was not going to last, had to be revised. People believed that now the colonels were there to stay. And what is very interesting is that the main form that signals this shift, the main sort of decision, is a reform of the censorship regime, which on surface sounds like pretty terrible. The replacement of a preemptive censorship regime by a suppressive censorship regime. So it sounds pretty bad. In reality, what that meant is that whereas in the first period a lot of cultural products had to be submitted to the authorities and receive permission, under the new regime, people could publish what they wanted with a proviso that if what they did was not approved, they would pay a price. Now, that sounds very bad, but in reality, that opens tremendous opportunities because you can do a lot of things. You can test the limits of what you can do. There is always a risk, but very often the risk is not realized. So it gives you much more space. More generally, that raises the problem of what is the relationship between authoritarianism and culture. And the idea, of course, here is that there is a contradiction between those two terms. Culture flourishes under freedom, authoritarianism suppresses freedom, so we have two essentially clashing trends. But If we look into the details, we may find various, interesting strands of variation at how these two things influence each other. And a general question that I think needs to be asked is not whether the regime was repressive and restrictive, which is something that people always emphasize, for example, illustrating various measures of censorship, but whether those measures were actually effective in preventing people from expressing themselves. And that is a much more, I would say, difficult question to ask, but also a much more interesting one. And when one moves away from this idea of continuity and ubiquity of repression, and I'm going to say a few things more about censorship in a few minutes, then one discovers that a sort of indirect and unwanted effect of the dictatorship is essentially to make the cultural sphere into the primary sphere of public life. Because politics is no longer possible, because people cannot express themselves politically, organize politically, or act politically, culture fills that gap and becomes a substitute, not just for political life, to the extent that it can be expressed, and it is always expressed even under very repressive circumstances, but also because culture acquires a value that it doesn't have under democratic circumstances. Artists are not just out there to entertain us, but they represent a deeper strand in the national soul. They take on a role that they, under normal conditions, often they do not have. And the other thing that needs to be emphasized here is that essentially the regime itself placed culture in the center by essentially outlawing songs, the songs of Theodorakis, by making songs a central political aspect of its policy. And the reason he did so was because Mikis Theodorakis was not just a composer, but also a political leader, and his songs had a lot of resonance in politics. But by doing that, they essentially made the point that culture was incredibly important. So, and that, I think, gave the provided the ability to many artists, for many artists to express themselves as not just representatives of themselves and their art, but also as something much more important and relevant. A second thing that is important to emphasize here is that censorship practices and restrictive practices are bureaucratic practices. You need to figure out who does what. You need to go over, complex and long texts, songs, scripts for movies, for theater. And very often what you find is that bureaucracies are not very good at figuring out the big picture. So when you look at what they did, very often you discover that they were censoring details that appear to us not to be very important and not caring about things that were much more obvious. And there are plenty of examples of that. I'm not going to tell you more about that right now. On top of it, bureaucracies are usually inefficient, especially in places like Greece. They are overloaded. They have a lot of work, and that translates to very inefficient ways of applying their powers. And what is very interesting, and that's not unique to Greece, but certainly Greece is a place where one can very easily imagine and see how these processes work, censorship was all about bargaining. And you had various strategies that artists developed, people like Dionysis Avopoulos, for example. They would, for example, add things that were seen as very extreme in order to protect the kinds of things they really cared about in the core of their music. They would go, there is a process in academic life which is called revise and resubmit. Well, it was used by the Greek bureaucracy. They would be sent back and they would have to come back, and there would be a process of back and forth that a lot of creators, including Savopoulos himself, describe in a great detail. But the most important thing that a lot of scholars have pointed out was that very often censorship had a sort of unintended positive effect on the creative process by spurring a process of creative repurposing, by forcing people to write in ways that were very different, that were not literary in their sense, very indirect, but also much more poetic. And people like Savvopoulos are credited precisely with inventing a language that remained powerful and also had the ability to survive changes in times, precisely because it had this kind of poetic and abstract quality. If it was more literary, more specific, and to the point, it may not have had this kind of effect. And so there is quite a lot of work about how these kinds of restrictions had also this paradoxical but actually powerful effect in facilitating high-quality creative processes. And so I would say, overall, when you look at how censorship was applied, what you find is that the people who were very successful in producing high-quality theater, movies, or music essentially saw that this set of obstacles as obstacles that could be overcome, not as limits to what they could say, not as a handicap that could not be faced and overcome, but rather than as a way to solve this problem. There is a very nice, there are lots of examples, and I'm going to say to you perhaps a bit more about that, about how people thought about these processes. But there's a very nice moment in which someone I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, the director Theodoros Angelopoulos, presents his new movie, which is called Days of 1936. I'll say more about that in a few minutes, to an audience in the avant-première. And the movie is extremely political. It's a movie about a dictatorship. But it's not the present-day dictatorship in Greece, it's the Metaxas dictatorship. So the movie takes place in the 1930s. Not many names are named, so it has this kind of very indirect style that became, in fact, the signature style of Angelopoulos. But you can see and you can feel, and people became very adept at understanding that it is a critique of the regime. And so at some point there is a person in the audience, and of course there is a policeman as well, and there's a person in the audience who stands up and says, "Is this movie what we think it is?" And Angelopoulos replies, "Yes." And the room erupts in applause. Nobody has infringed any law. Nothing was said that can be actually controlled. But you have an example of the power of this kind of mutual self-understanding. The bottom line is that, in fact, those conditions created much more space for creation, and I would argue much more space, and this is a difficult claim to prove, but I think it's a claim that's worth discussing, than you would have had without the conditions of dictatorship. And it's not uncommon to Greece. If you think about Iranian cinema, for example, you can see that certain types of circumstances under authoritarianism create the kind of creative energy that translates into high-quality art, that manages to transcend national boundaries and to transcend times as well. And so I'm going to just go over a very broad brush picture of these 5 cultural fields to give you a sense of what was produced during the time and why we believe it's a cultural big bang of the time. Fiction, non-fiction, and poetry were areas in which there was a lot of flourishing. One of the most interesting books that came out in 1972 by the very emblematic publishing house Kedros, which is associated with the left, is a book by a writer named Andreas Frangias, and it's called The Plague. The title of the book is not by chance. It refers to Albert Camus' book, but it's the first book that came out in Greece about the experience of Macronissos, which is a place of exile for leftists during the Greek Civil War and in its immediate aftermath. It is very surprising to hear that the first book about that experience comes during the dictatorship in 1972, but it's an example of the kinds of things that were possible, and it's a book that doesn't name the place, but the place is easily understood by everyone who reads about. The book was just republished these days. A very different kind of book, probably the biggest bestseller of the time, is the book by Kostas Stathis, The Third Wreath, το τρίτο στεφάνι. It's a book that initially appears in 1962 and is totally ignored by everyone. No one pays any attention to it. And it is republished in 1970 and becomes a huge bestseller. It's a book about the experience of the Greek Civil War and Greek politics as experienced by ordinary people, we could say. It uses a language that's extremely different from the standard literary language of Greek literature, and it really resonates with the public. You would be very surprised, of course, to hear that communist poets and writers such as Ritsos and Tsirkas experience a boom in terms of republication of their old works and publication of new works, and that there is a general boom and rise, which can be quantified in the number of publishing houses, in the number of bookstores, and especially there is a boom in a very particular type of book, political books. And among political books, Marxist books experience a boom. They are published for the first time in such large quantity during that time. And the explanation for that is that the regime didn't really care very much about that. It thought it was fine for this type of books to be published. They didn't affect them directly. And at the same time, next to that, we have a very important explosion of the so-called pocket books, the so-called Viper books, which really multiply the number of readers. And it's very interesting to think about that expansion of readership at a time in which readership and reading are collapsing. And of course, the lifestyle press, people like Kostas Kavathas, Tesseris Trochi, the specialized press about cars, all that is starting during this period. I'll show you two covers of books that have a very strong political kind of message that come out during this time, but I want to emphasize that it's not just about political books, it's also about this other type. Mikis Theodorakis, of course, his songs were forbidden, but he could publish, and you see here how the application of restrictions was not uniform across different cultural fields. And a famous book, which is a translation of a book by a British social scientist about student organizing, which is going to be very influential in getting students to organize and participate in the uprising of the Polytechnic later on. And you can see even the aesthetics of it are very clearly pointing to a very specific style. I'm not going to say much about theater because it's much more difficult to summarize. The things to emphasize here is that there is an impressive rise in both the quantity and quality of theater troupes and of plays. There is really an explosion, and reading the list of what is being staged in Athens during those times is really impressive. But what is very interesting, and we have the work of Professor Van Steen here to thank for, and others, there is a boom in avant-garde theater, especially sort of politically far out and very sort of experimental type of work, which is mostly expressed in there are a variety of groups, people like Marietta Rialdi and others, but there is a group that really makes its mark, and it's called Elefthero Theatro, free theater, which is essentially a collective of artists who were mostly Maoist in orientation and who put together some extremely successful plays during that time. And the idea was that they didn't need a director, that everything was going to be collective, everything was going to be organized together. So very sort of advanced for its time. Cinema, we have the rise of the so-called New Greek cinema, Neos Hellenikos Kinematografos, which is associated with people like Pantelis Voulgaris, but especially beyond everyone else, Theodoros Angelopoulos. It's a time after 1970 of the decline of Greek commercial cinema, which was not uniformly bad, by the way, and the decline is not caused by the dictatorship, it's caused by the rise of television. People stopped going to theaters because they have a TV at home. And so during that time, we have the rise of these kinds of new films by directors who see themselves not as members or employees of large studios, but really as auteurs, as full-time creators. And the Thessaloniki Film Festival of 1972 is the instance in which all these movies win prizes. And these are state prizes, by the way. And of course, as I mentioned, Theodoros Angelopoulos, and this is the poster for his movie days of 1936, which was advertised as the first Greek political movie. So you have a political movie about a dictatorship during that time, and it went very well. It did very well. I think over 100,000 people went to see it. Music is very interesting because music is probably the most powerful cultural industry in Greece. It's clearly the most popular, it sells the more, it's the most influential. And of course, the period is very much associated with Dionysis Savvopoulos, unfortunately the late Dionysis Savvopoulos, who has begun his career in 1965 with a style of singing and songwriting associated with, a simple guitar. But in 1969, in 1972 and in 1973, produces 3 records that are recognized by most people as the most powerful and the most innovative and creative records of his career. He continues to produce very interesting records that people consider the trilogy of Περιβόλη του Τρελού, Μπάλος, and Βρώμικο Ψωμί as the core of his creative success. He's not the only one. Yannis Markopoulos, who is kind of forgotten today, but not his songs, produces essentially, I would say, the most important corpus of his work during that time in records such as Χρονικό or Θητεία, songs that are easy to recognize. When you hear them, you still recognize they're still being played, using the voice of a sort of Cretan singer and instrument player of Lyra, Xylouris, who became known during that period. Not only that, but the pop and rock scene explode. It's a period in which we have many new groups that introduce forms of music that have become successful elsewhere. I'll show you a few covers. This is the famous Βρώμικο Ψωμί cover by Dionysis Savvopoulos, 1973, and you see he's working, even the sort of, the qualities, the aesthetic qualities of the picture point to a creative process that's very interesting. This is an interview of Yannis Markopoulos for a Greek magazine. He introduces a movement which is called Return to the Roots, so challenging precisely this great rise of pop and rock music. So, it's a very live period in which various trends come together, people debate about these issues all the time. And this is the most successful commercial pop record by a group named Paul, which is sold in a sack. I mean, it was a marketing, I think it sold over 200,000 copies at the time, enormous numbers. And of course, this is the first rock group, Socrates. Very often there is a sense that the dictatorship was trying to punish and marginalize and repress young people with long hair. And that was true of the first couple of years, but it ceases to be true after 1970. And this becomes completely part of mainstream culture. There is much more than that. I'm just giving you that to get a sense. On art, I don't have much to show you, unfortunately. I will just put, this picture by the painter Akrithakis, because it has the kind of color scheme that I think reflects what we believe is a very strong feeling within society that emphasizes this kind of explosive sense of aesthetics that we forget about. But the point to make here is that there are hundreds of shows by all well-known painters. In short, I will argue that not only culture thrived during that time, and especially the 4 years between 70 and 73. The end of 73 is both the peak of that boom, but also the beginning of its decline because of the repression that follows the Polytechnic School uprising. But that there was a true boom. And that this is really remarkable in terms of its capacity to cover so much ground. Which leads us to the second question: why was there such boom? I focus on the censorship to say that the obstacles that the regime put were not strong enough to prevent that from happening. But what was essentially the push factor behind that? And I think it is worth highlighting 4 processes that explain that. The first process is socioeconomic. There is an economic boom during that time, which continues the great boom that begins in Greece after the end of the Second World War. There is modernization, urbanization, the expansion, massive expansion of university education, the creation of new universities, and of course the rise of a new middle class, a new urban middle class that begins to consume culture as a matter of status and as a matter of position. Lots of young people with higher education. This is the kind of environment that is very propitious for the consumption of culture and therefore facilitating its production. The second element has to do with global culture. The aftershocks of what we describe as the students' uprisings of May 68 come to Greece. Greece is not isolated from the rest of the world. People read about what is going on elsewhere, they imitate trends, and that has a powerful effect. I think it's probably a solid hypothesis to say that the sexual revolution really happens in Greece during that time, where people's sexual habits change, especially young people's habits. The third point is a substitution effect, which I mentioned before, that cultural sphere becomes very powerful because the political sphere moves away. And suddenly artists see themselves as being at the center of life, and that, I think, facilitates the creative process, creates a lot of self-confidence. It creates a lot of processes of osmosis. When Dionysis Avopoulos comes and presents his song in Rodeo, you have an audience that's composed of intellectuals, of poets, of writers. It is remarkable to see how much cross-fertilization there is during that time. The field of publishing and the field of theater are connected with each other. Theater is connected with music. It's just remarkable to see this kind of ferment. And given that people don't have politics to distract them, they really use culture as politics, but also use culture as culture much more than they would otherwise. And there is also a very interesting smaller effect, the fact that left-wing parties are not around. Usually those parties, the Communist Party especially, acted as a gatekeeper about what is good and what is less good, what should be promoted and what not, in a very sort of heavy-handed way. Its absence creates space, and it's associated also with the rise of extreme leftist groups that are very much opposed to the traditional Communist Party. Maoists, Trotskyites, and others, but also it opens up space for things that are not directly political either. And so when you see very often, and I'm going to return to this point, a critique of that period as being culturally dead, very often people don't like the fact that there is not very high quality, but high quality commercial culture as well during that time, which they don't like very much. In terms of the relationship between culture and politics, I already alluded to some points. And I would argue that even though culture was a way to resist or to certainly voice discontent or to voice critique about the regime, it was also much more than that. I think culture really came into its own, and people found themselves in these kinds of rare moments of cultural ferment, as I mentioned, in which things come together. But also, I would argue this is a time of rising expectations and optimism, because the society becomes wealthier. And even though political conditions are restrictive, economic and social life is expanding. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, and I'm going to return to it. But I would also say that the spirit of May 68 brings in individualism into the picture, in which people see themselves as individuals, they see life as something to be enjoyed, and new collective identities also emerge, student identities, for example, which are much weaker before. And so when you think about culture in music during that period, it's much more than those three, but very often people fixate on Theodorakis, whose songs are actually listened to in a sort of clandestine or semi-clandestine way, but really the big innovation comes from people like Savopoulos and Markopoulos, who are new and who emerge during that time and come to their own and become big stars during that time. And I'm going to conclude with the question of amnesia. Why did we forget about this remarkable moment, if we are right in our argument, that it was remarkable? The argument here is that there has been a post-dictatorship reconstruction of life during the dictatorship, which emphasized primarily the regime, and which was very much based and displayed and responded to a generalized field of guilt and sometimes even opportunism. Why guilt? Because most people had fun, I would argue, during that time, and that's not something that felt right when the dictatorship collapsed. And a lot of people felt very guilty about that. And especially people in the creative sector felt that it was not easy to say that they were so successful during that period and so creative when, in fact, the dictatorship was such a terrible regime. So that creates a sort of contradiction, a sort of cognitive dissonance almost, that I think was very important in helping us understand how the narrative of this period was rewritten. And at the same time, there was always a very strong rejection among especially the left of pop culture and consumerism. A lot of people, for example, who study rock music in Greece conclude that after 1974 there is a decline of rock music, which is very much associated with the rise of explicitly political song, especially after 1974. And that forces us, I think, to view the transition to democracy, which is known as metapolitefsi, not just as a beginning, but also to think about it as a sort of trauma for the people who really were very successful during this previous period and felt that they were not in a position to express pride in that kind of success. And I think, as a concluding point, that this brings us to a very interesting finding, which I didn't expect to reach at the beginning of this project, the presence of an enormous blind spot in our understanding and study of the dictatorship. When you look at the studies of that period, they overwhelmingly focus on the regime, the state, and to a smaller extent on the resistance, which was very limited and very small for most of the period. There is almost nothing about society, about societal dynamics, about how society changes, and essentially what you have is an implicit assumption that society, Greek society, goes to sleep in 1967 and wakes up in 1974 as if nothing had happened in between. And there is silence about it, which I find, in retrospect, is quite shocking. But the thing is that Greece, between 74 and 67, has changed enormously. And you can capture that just by looking at GDP growth per year, which has a sort of a very dynamic dimension. But you can also look at it from a perspective of a more indirect, but I think very funny way, which is to look at pictures of people. And this is Dionysis Avropoulos in 1965. He's 21 years old. He was born in 1944. He looks a bit like an old man, right? That was the style. That was Greece in 1965. And then fast forward 5 years later, 1970, same person. Looks much younger, very different style. Everything has changed. This change that happened during that time is completely ignored, completely not captured. I'll show you a last picture, which I think is extremely interesting and very funny. It's a private picture of a person who became a music producer, but at the time he's just very active in student politics to some extent, but primarily in rock music. His name is Stelios Eliniadis. He has a blog, and so he put it on his blog, which is where we found it. And this guy is very much into rock and roll and the life that goes with it. And he participates almost inadvertently in the uprising of the Polytechnic schools. His friends go there, so he goes with them. And when the army invades, he escapes. And he finds refuge, along with his girlfriend, in the house of another friend. And he takes a picture that I'm going to show you, which I think is remarkable because it almost looks like a selfie at the time, and it shows what kind of country, especially for young people, especially in Athens, what kind of country Greece was in the end of 1973. And that is the picture, which I think captures this element of modernity and of connection to global trends that I think we completely miss based on the way we approach this period, precisely because we cannot disconnect the regime from society. I think it's a very nice picture. Final slide, or almost final. I'm going to show you a poster that was made by an artist from Thessaloniki, Sterios Delialis, who is the guy who made the cover from Περιβόλη του Τρελούδη, Dionysis Avopoulos' book, and it's a poster which I'm going to show you without any other comment, 1972. It's a very different depiction of Greece from what we have come to believe, and I think it really is remarkable. So why does the Big Bang matters? I would say, first of all, and that's a question I asked at the beginning, it's a fascinating story. You discover characters and pieces of art that we're very strongly associated with, and I think the reaction that we see with the death of Savvopoulos is very often depicted as representing his activity and work during the democratic period, but we forget how important was his work during the dictatorship for his establishment as an artist. So it's a fascinating story in which suddenly a lot of pieces of work that you never think are connected with this period are in fact the products of that period. I think it's a way to correct what is essentially a very important error of both fact and interpretation, the fact that culture dies. I think it alerts us to a huge blind spot, which is the importance of social and cultural dynamics and not just of the regime and the state. And finally, I think it deepens our understanding of the period and forces us to revisit it and opens new avenue for asking questions that otherwise tend to be brushed aside and ignored. And so all of that, as I said, this is the first talk I'm giving about this project, but all of that is part, and especially what makes it particularly interesting, all of what I've described in a lot of detail is included in a book, which unfortunately is coming out only in Greek, because all these cultural products are Greek, and is going to appear in early December, and that is the cover of the book that is giving all the evidence that you need, the depictions, biographies of the main people, and really, I think, opens this period to a completely new understanding. So thank you very much for your attention, and we can start the Q&A as well.
Just before we start with your questions, I would like to thank again Professor Kalivas for such an inspiring presentation, because we get to learn a lot, those of us who are slightly younger. But I also felt that a sad coincidence, of course, but it was probably the best tribute that we could have for Dionysis Savvopoulos. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yes, we are ready for your questions.
Yes.
One is, thank you. You call it Big Bang. That signifies the beginning of something that continues. Does the cultural creativity keep going after 1974, or is there a sort of decrease in creative powers after that? And the other question is about the sort of myth about repression during those years. To what extent have the artists themselves contributed to the creation of the idea that art was suppressed? I remember Angelopoulos talking, for example, about how he had to, submit Theosos to the censoring committee, and he had to, bargain, as you said. Savvopoulos mentions things like similar instances. So to what extent have they also contributed to this kind of creation of a myth?
Well, I'll start with the second question. They have contributed very often in indirect ways. Savvopoulos says a lot of things about the role of censorship, but also at the same time, very often, he was very open about how censorship was not an obstacle for him. There is a sentence, for example, in one of his interviews in which he said, «Σιγά μη μας εμπόδιζε εμάς η λογοκρισία». But I think, there was almost a sort of social, automatic kind of statement in which whenever you mention the dictatorship, you mention censorship, without thinking about whether, in fact, it produced the effects that it was intended to produce. And, more generally, I would say the sort of things that people mention about the time of the dictatorship have to pass this kind of filter, not saying of something that might be heard or perceived as politically incorrect. Because, you know, the narrative of the post-dictatorship period is so strong because essentially the new regime, the democracy, has to legitimize itself, and, you know, all regimes want to paint a very stark contrast. But the point here is not to say that the dictatorship was not a bad regime. It was a terrible regime in many respects, but to say that in spite of being a terrible regime, society could actually find ways to develop. And there is something to be told about a symbiosis, which was not always without tensions, but which, however, I think is a source of perhaps inspiration and optimism, because even under very difficult times, perhaps not under extremely difficult times, there are regimes that do not allow anything, but certainly a lot of authoritarian regimes leave space, and that space can be used, and this is good for society. So I think there is a sort of optimistic dimension here. Now, on the first question, which is about the aftermath, it's very difficult to make very strong statements about the development of culture because it's very difficult to quantify it, and especially it's very difficult to quantify what are the most intangible aspects, which are, for example, the duration of a piece of art. I mean, you can't possibly think of ways to do so. Generally speaking, the study of Greek culture assumes that there is this kind of renaissance in the early 60s, then everything collapses, and then there is a return to normality that people don't really know how to assess. And it was very interesting because last year was the 50th anniversary of the transition to democracy. You had lots of surveys of various fields, of literature, of theater, of cinema. And what you find is very often a sort of difficulty of saying whether the developments after 1974 were as good as people expected, as should have been, or not. I would argue that we can see some forms of continuity in especially the sort of more commercial and pop elements of culture, but we can also see breaks. The story of Elefthero Theater is very interesting because they sort of collapse essentially after a couple of years. A lot of artists are not able to replicate this process. Savvopoulos goes through a crisis and has to reinvent himself, but that's not what happens to everyone. And there is a very interesting story which we tell in the book, which is the story of Mikis Theodorakis, who is not present in Greece, but really becomes a global star during that time, being in exile. He organizes and performs in concerts in all continents, is feted by world leaders. And he gives interviews, which are published, by the way, in the Greek press during the dictatorship, in which he says that he believes he's on the cusp of replicating his big feat of reinventing Greek music that he did in the 1960s. He's in the cusp of replicating that. And he comes back to Greece as a hero. And then he is not elected as deputy in the elections of November 1974 for the first time. He was a deputy before. He loses his creative ability. He grows isolated, and he never reaches the kind of cultural success that he enjoyed beforehand. So even people who adopt a much more political stand like Theodorakis suffer a lot after the transition. And I think there is a sort of aspect of the transition that is not really told because, myself included, we see it as a uniformly positive process. But I think it poses a lot of challenges for creative types who very often thrive under conditions of adversity. Yes?
Thank you, very interesting. I have a question about the preceding period. So many of the push factors that you mentioned that kind of pollinated this cultural revolution would have happened, I think, regardless of the dictatorship, things like the economic boom, social modernization, and so on. So I guess the question, I guess from the social science perspective, would be, had the dictatorship, what was it instrumental, do you think, for this cultural boom? Or do you think that something like that is very likely to have happened regardless? Or what are the characteristics that were that are easy to imagine in an authoritarian context, but perhaps less easy to imagine in a freer context, which was the case in the early 60s?
It's very difficult to answer this question because it's a counterfactual, but I'll give you two, I think, answers to that. I would say that the one thing that on the economic side, there is no question that the boom would have continued, that there would be, the new middle classes would have consumed culture, so all these factors would have existed no matter what, irrespective of the presence of the dictatorship. The one thing that the dictatorship adds is the combination of the substitution of the political sphere by the cultural one, so culture becomes very central, and also the kind of removal of left-wing gatekeeping organizations. So these are the two things that are unique to the dictatorship, not May 68 and not the economic boom. So one has to make an assessment, would the first two without the other two produce the same effect? So very, very tough to answer. On the second thing about the effect of the dictatorship, there is a story that Savopoulos says, actually, and since it's a good opportunity to discuss it, when the dictatorship comes, people, we sort of have a sort of ex post linear way of understanding people's trajectories, very much like countries. So we assume that, Savopoulos goes from success to success. Savopoulos publishes his first record in 1965, it's Fortigo. It is not very successful. And then he goes into a crisis in 1966 and 67, in which he doesn't produce much. And then the dictatorship arrives, and then in August of 1967, he's arrested. He's not arrested because he participates in the resistance, but probably by mistake, the police think that he carries a letter of Mikis Theodorakis. But he's not, in fact, and he says so himself. So he's arrested and tortured in prison. And he tells a story about how, being in prison, he realizes that his songwriting ability is his way to essentially achieve a higher state of consciousness. That he discovers and he decides that he wants to really become a singer-songwriter at that moment. Of course, you can say he reconstructs that ex post, but he argues and has said repeatedly that he wrote at least 3 of his most famous songs during his stay in prison. And after that, he's so shocked and so traumatized by his experience in prison that he flees the country with his wife. They go to his girlfriend then. They go to France. He experiences May 68 from very close by. He wouldn't have done that, I would argue, without that experience. And then he goes to Italy. And at the end of the year, at the end of 1968, he returns to Greece. He gets married. And he starts writing Perivoli Trelou, performing, which appears a year later, in October 1969. So I would argue, if you look at his biography, it's clear that his experience of leaving the country and of having experienced prison are instrumental in how he develops and understands his roles, how he decides to switch styles. He's not a rock musician. He rejects rock music back in 1965, and then he appears completely different in 1968 and 1969. So I think, that's a sort of individual biography. The book contains 11 biographies of people who are very well known, who are really creative during that period. And one of the elements that comes out is precisely how the mix of opportunities that existed in Greek society during that time and the restrictions that had to be faced work almost magically to produce this kind of creativity. So it's not a social scientific answer, but I think it's the best we can do. Yes?
During that time, there are other dictatorships in Europe, like Spain, right? So I don't know if you're aware of the same trend happening here in Italian society. If yes, someone might say that might be, if there is a suppression, how to grows, or maybe, I don't know, it might be a unique case for Greece, so I don't know if you have any knowledge of that.
It's difficult to compare these other dictatorships because they're much longer. There is an argument about the sort of post-dictatorship Franco art, which is known as the Movida, how that really begins before the end of the dictatorship. Portugal is a much more provincial society, much smaller society. I would say The two examples that I can give you, because there is no systematic study of that, unfortunately, in the social sciences, are Iran, which is very authoritarian, very restrictive, but for a number of reasons, cinema, and to a lesser extent, which is not very well known outside fiction, have bloomed. Another example is Brazil, which is perhaps the least repressive of the Latin American dictatorships, less repressive than Argentina and Chile, where you have the rise of the Tropicalia music movement and the avant-garde theater as well during the dictatorship. There are comparisons between East Germany and Czechoslovakia. The East German regime was much more repressive, so much less culture, whereas Czechoslovakia was a place, especially where theater was very important. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, the leader of post-communist Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, was a writer. So there are a number of examples that suggest that under some conditions you can have this kind of creative ferment. But there isn't, to at least to my knowledge, there are no systematic comparative studies. I would suspect that there is, if the case in Greece is representative to some extent, it is perhaps also representative of the ex post rewriting of its history, in which those periods completely disappear. So if you say are a scholar, a comparative scholar of culture, and want to write something about cultures under dictatorship, and you reach out to the literature on Greek culture during the dictatorship, it's very likely that what you are going to get out of it was that it was a time of nothingness, for the most. Yes?
You sort of said it's difficult to quantify culture.
Yes.
In the last 2 decades, would you say that culture has flourished? And you obviously don't have the repression of the 70s, like we're a democracy in Greece. You've had the push factor, austerity. Back then it was the dictatorship. But to me, not to preempt your answer, it feels like we haven't had this flourishing. You don't have the Savopoulos, the Ritsos, the Seferis, Hadzidakis. You don't have these artists today. Why is that?
That's the 1 million question.
And maybe is it economic, the fact that maybe we're not flourishing economically as much as we might have in other decades? Is that hindering that, perhaps?
It's a very good question. I've thought a lot about that, and I don't have definitive answers. I would say there is an exception. I mean, there are people now who are quantifying culture by using tools like large models that can collect, a lot of information about publishing music. What is more difficult to do is to assess the quality of a cultural product in terms of its ability to survive over time, but I think even that can be achieved quantitatively. You can say that a particular song has a staying power because people listen to it years after it has been produced. So there is a possibility of doing that. Perhaps it's more difficult to do the more intangible aspects of the kinds of things that really are associated with stages of your life. So the reason why a lot of people are so upset about Savopoulos' death is because they grew up with his songs. And so his songs are associated with particular points of your life and therefore become part of your identity. Now, why not high quality culture during the crisis, which I think is true. I don't think that we've seen a flourishing. It may have to do with the fact, with socioeconomic dynamics, that society was hit financially, whereas society was on the upswing financially during the 70s, and therefore had a very different kind of optimistic outlook, which facilitated perhaps both a process of selection, people becoming artists, a process of self-confidence, people believing because there is a flourishing domestic market that they can produce things that are going to be appreciated. Whereas I think during the financial crisis, none of those elements existed. Also at the time, even though a lot of people left Greece, it's a very interesting thing, exit was not common. The people who left Greece were people from the previous generation of artists, which actually had, in a very interesting way, a positive effect because it also eliminated some gatekeeping mechanisms. It made it easy for young people with no prior record to really break into that market, which is not an easy thing normally because you have a lot of these kinds of hierarchies. And Angelopoulos in particular, when he wins with his first movie, the big prize in Thessaloniki in 1970 for the movie Anaparastasi, he tells an interviewer that he's a much better director than Kakoyannis, which under normal conditions he would have never done because Kakoyannis would be around and certainly blocking his possibilities. But he feels much more free about it. So there are a number of very interesting mechanisms that can be observed that are totally indirect but connected to this process.
Wondering what is your opinion on the regime perhaps allowing this cultural boom consciously, because by sustaining culture, they were sustaining themselves. They were prolonging their own survival by keeping people content, entertained, in a way, as Huxley would say, Brave New World. By keeping people entertained and contained, they were less likely perhaps to revolt. And you mentioned there was the economic boom, so that combination of prosperity and entertainment could perhaps make people less likely to object to that censorship. And as long as it was under control, as long as it wasn't too profound, the criticism, and perhaps we feel guilt during metapolitevsy, there is a stigma about it, but people at the end of the day, they want to enjoy prosperity, safety. It's all very positive nuances that the regime allowed. And I'm against dictatorship, for the record.
It's a very good point. I would say my reaction would be that on the one hand, I don't think the dictators were so sophisticated as to devise a plan of that sort. I think they were primarily, if you look at sociological studies of their social origins, a lot of them came from rural families, so they were not really steeped into modern cultural ways. So probably they thought that a lot of this cultural kind of thing was, they let it happen because they didn't really care very much about. And there is prima facie evidence that perhaps that was the fact. They didn't really have a full-fledged strategy about how to deal with it. The second point is that culture is always, these kinds of processes are so tricky to study because there's always two sides to them. On the one hand, keeping people happy is great, but on the other hand, it can backfire on you in the sense that the most highly socially mobile group of people at the time, the students, the most prosperous and people with very high prospects of future employment. There is a very nice statement by one of the leaders of the student movement of the time, Mimis Androulakis, who says, we were not revolting because we felt we were falling behind. We felt we were recognized as leaders of society, and we didn't like what was happening in our country. So culture served as a vehicle of radicalization of the students during that time. And there's a very nice study by Kostis Kornetis, which precisely studies the relationship between culture and radicalization that led to the uprising of the Polytechnic school in Athens. So culture had that kind of mobilizing aspect as well. So it was not just a way to make people sleep and consent. It also had the opposite effect. And I think what makes these kinds of processes so fascinating to study is precisely because they never go one way. And they almost always defeat the expectations of people who try to manipulate them. And it's very interesting to think about the large picture of my presentation today, which is to say that you have a group of people who are completely sort of uncultured, the colonels and the military officers who basically rule the country, who are repressive, who don't like freedom, whose cultural ideas are very retrograde, and yet they put things and organize things in such a way as to produce a very big cultural boom in the opposite direction. I think that's wonderful if you think about it. So, perhaps that's the kind of message that I would like to leave you to go to bed with.
Έχουμε την ευκαιρία λοιπόν να μιλήσουμε με την κυρία Τσιάδη Μαρία, η οποία είναι μέλος της Επιτροπής του Συνδέσμου Μακεδόνων και
Μακεδονικής Ένωσης Μεγάλης Βρετανίας.
Βεβαίως. Λοιπόν, και θέλουμε να μας πείτε λίγα λόγια για τις δραστηριότητες σας.
Βεβαίως. Όπως είπα και κατά την εισαγωγή, η Μακεδονική Ένωση Μεγάλης Βρετανίας ιδρύθηκε το 1989 Κάποια από τα ιδρυτικά μας μέλη συνεχίζουν και είναι ακόμη στο Διοικητικό Συμβούλιο της Ένωσης. Είχα τη χαρά, για να είμαι ειλικρινής, να είμαι μέλος του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου σε πολύ μικρή ηλικία. Το 1996 εκλέχθηκα μέλος της Ένωσης και ορίστηκα τότε ως εκπρόσωπος τύπου, οπότε ασχολούμαι ιδιαιτέρως κυρίως με δημοσιεύματα που αφορούσαν στη Θεσσαλονίκη, στην Μακεδονία, στη Βόρεια Ελλάδα. Στόχος της Ένωσης είναι καθαρά η προβολή και προαγωγή των ιστορικών γεγονότων της ιστορίας, όχι μόνο της Ελλάδος γενικότερα, αλλά ειδικότερα της Μακεδονίας. Και φυσικά το ότι η Μακεδονία παραμένει ελληνική, η ιστορία της παραμένει ελληνική και οι όποιες δραστηριότητες έχουν ως στόχο το να φέρουμε κοντά και τους Έλληνες του Λονδίνου, να μάθουν περισσότερα για τη Μακεδονία και να μάθουν περισσότερα και για την Ένωση.
Και φαντάζομαι και για την κουλτούρα, τη διατήρηση της κουλτούρας, όπως ήταν και το απόψινό, ας πούμε,
φυσικά.
Η απόψινή διάλεξη.
Φυσικά.
Ναι, που ήταν βασισμένη πάνω στην κουλτούρα και την περίοδο της δικτατορίας.
Βεβαίως, βεβαίως. Ένα από τα βασικότερα στοιχεία άλλωστε της ελληνικής κληρονομιάς και της μακεδονικής κληρονομιάς είναι η κουλτούρα, είναι οι καλλιτέχνες οι οποίοι γεννήθηκαν στην Ελλάδα και δραστηριοποιήθηκαν, και απόψε η εκδήλωση σκόπευε στο να παρουσιάσει στο ευρύτερο κοινό μία περίοδο η οποία δεν είναι τόσο ιδιαίτερα γνωστή για τα πολιτισμικά και πολιτιστικά δρόμενα κατά τη διάρκεια της επταετίας, όπως είπατε, μεταξύ του 70 και του 73, που όπως και ο καθηγητής ο κύριος Καλύβας εξήγησε πολύ καλύτερα από ό,τι μπορώ εγώ βέβαια, την άνθηση η οποία υπήρξε εκείνη την περίοδο, για πολλούς διαφορετικούς λόγους βέβαια. Και ήταν και η συγκυρία τέτοια, όπως είπα, και δυσάρεστη ίσως συγκυρία, που δυστυχώς έφυγε, χάσαμε το Διονύση Σαββόπουλο, μία από τις μεγαλύτερες μορφές της μουσικής σκηνής στην Ελλάδα, ο οποίος σαν φιγούρα πρωτοστάτησε κατά τη διάρκεια της επταετίας.
Ποια είναι η επόμενη εκδήλωση που προγραμματίζει ο σύνδεσμος?
Έχουμε κάτι υπόψη, έχουμε 2-3 διαφορετικές εκδηλώσεις, τις οποίες προγραμματίζουμε για του χρόνου, από το νέο έτος βέβαια, από το 2026. Ενδιαφέροντα πράγματα, θα τα δείτε και στην ιστοσελίδα μας. Ίσως κάτι πιο κοντά στο Μέγα Αλέξανδρο την επόμενη φορά και στην Αμφίπολη.
Ωραία. Σας ευχαριστούμε και ευχόμαστε κάθε επιτυχία.
Και εγώ να είστε καλά, καλό σας βράδυ. Ευχαριστώ.
Κύριε Καλύβα, να σας συγχαρούμε για την απόψινή διάλεξη που είναι οπωσδήποτε βασισμένη πάνω στο βιβλίο σας Big Bang 1970 μέχρι 1973, περίοδος λοιπόν η οποία ήταν μάλλον δικτατορική περίοδος.
Σίγουρα,
Ναι.
μάλλον, δικτατορική περίοδος και δύσκολη πολιτικά περίοδος. Οπότε αυτό που διερευνούμε σε αυτό το βιβλίο είναι τις κοινωνικές διεργασίες και ιδιαίτερα στον χώρο του πολιτισμού και της κουλτούρας, στη μουσική, στο θέατρο, στον κινηματογράφο, τι συμβαίνει εκείνα τα χρόνια. Υπάρχει η αίσθηση πολλές φορές ότι δεν συνέβαινε τίποτα λόγω των καταπιεστικών μέτρων του καθεστώτος, και αυτό που βρήκαμε στην έρευνά μας είναι ότι αυτά τα μέτρα δεν μπόρεσαν να ανασχέσουν μια μεγάλη ορμή που υπήρχε μέσα στην κοινωνία και η οποία εκφράστηκε και στον πολιτιστικό χώρο με τη δημιουργία πολιτιστικών προϊόντων με διαχρονική αξία, από τη μουσική του Διονύση Σαββόπουλου, του Γιάννη Μαρκόπουλου και πολλών άλλων καλλιτεχνών, τις ταινίες του Θόδωρου Αγγελόπουλου. Όλοι αυτοί εμφανίζονται και κάνουν τα πρώτα τους βήματα την εποχή εκείνη.
Ήταν μια περίοδος η οποία μάλλον όλοι αυτοί οι καλλιτέχνες συνάντησαν εμπόδια για να μπορούν να εκφραστούν, όμως τα κατάφεραν και έχουμε τύχει. Γι' αυτό και είναι μια περίοδος η οποία άνθησε ο πολιτισμός.
Καμιά φορά κάποια εμπόδια είναι για καλό που λένε και λειτουργήσαν ενισχυτικά, δημιούργησαν πάρα πολύ ικανά και μεγάλα δίκτυα αλληλεγγύης ανάμεσα στους καλλιτέχνες. Δημιούργησαν μεγάλη δίψα στον κόσμο να ενημερωθεί για τις καλλιτεχνικές εξελίξεις, κυρίως γιατί δεν υπήρχε η δυνατότητα συμμετοχή στην πολιτική, που ήταν απαγορευμένη. Οπότε η κουλτούρα και ο πολιτισμός λειτουργήσαν ως υποκατάστατα κατά κάποιο τρόπο της πολιτικής και αυτό τους έδωσε μια πολύ μεγάλη ορμή.
Είναι το βιβλίο σας ένα θέμα το οποίο ασχολείστε και με τους φοιτητές σας?
Όχι, αυτό το βιβλίο ουσιαστικά προέκυψε από μια έρευνα που κάναμε στην Ελλάδα. Οι φοιτητές μου στην Αγγλία ενδιαφέρονται κυρίως για θέματα τα οποία έχουν συγκριτική διάσταση. Μπορεί στο μέλλον να ασχοληθώ περισσότερο με τη συγκριτική διάσταση του θέματος. Κάτω από ποιες συνθήκες και κάτω από ποιες δικτατορίες αναπτύσσεται περισσότερο ο πολιτισμός και λιγότερο, φερειπίν.
Πού μπορεί κάποιος να το προμηθευτεί, αν ενδιαφέρεται?
Το βιβλίο κυκλοφορεί στις 4 Δεκεμβρίου, δεν έχει βγει ακόμα. Αυτό ήταν μια παρουσίαση που προηγείται της έκδοσης και θα κυκλοφορήσει σε όλα τα βιβλιοπωλεία στην Ελλάδα μετά τις 4 Δεκεμβρίου.
Ένα μήνυμα θέλω να μας δώσετε τώρα για τους νέους μας, οι οποίοι δυστυχώς δεν βλέπω πολύ νεολαία εδώ απόψε, έτσι για να τους τραβήξουμε κοντά στα ενδιαφέροντα τα πολιτιστικά και τέλος πάντων στα θέματα τα οποία θέλουμε να προωθήσουμε όσον αφορά τον ελληνισμό.
Σε κοινό νέων θα έκανα διαφορετικού τύπου παρουσίαση. Θα τους έβαζα να ακούσουν τα τραγούδια, να ακούσουν τη μουσική της εποχής εκείνης, η οποία σε πολλά σημεία είναι πρωτοποριακή. Αλλά το μήνυμα γενικά είναι αισιόδοξο. Είναι ότι ακόμα και όταν υπάρχουν εμπόδια, ακόμα και όταν η πολιτική κατάσταση εκτραχύνεται, πιστεύω οι δυνατότητες που παρουσιάζονται μέσω πολλών διαφορετικών δρόμων συμπεριλαμβανομένης και της καλλιτεχνικής δημιουργίας είναι μεγάλη. Και αυτό που έχει σημασία να καταλάβουμε είναι ότι ο πολιτισμός αφήνει ένα πολύ βαθύ αποτύπωμα στις ψυχές των ανθρώπων και το καταλαβαίνουμε βλέποντας το πώς λειτουργεί ο κόσμος τώρα με το θάνατο του Διονύση Σαββόπουλου και το πώς αυτός ο θάνατος έβγαλε στην επιφάνεια ένα σωρό συναισθήματα. Δηλαδή έχει ένα πολύ ισχυρό αποτύπωμα ο πολιτισμός. Είναι πολύ σημαντική και για την ταυτότητά μας ως Έλληνες. Τα τραγούδια στην ελληνική γλώσσα, η ποίηση, η λογοτεχνία είναι πράγματα τα οποία ουσιαστικά μας συνδέουν με μια κοινότητα άλλων ανθρώπων που χρησιμοποιούν την ίδια γλώσσα με εμάς. Και νομίζω ότι πέρα από όλα τα άλλα, το γεγονός ότι επιτρέπουν αυτή την πάρα πολύ μεγάλη δημιουργική ενασχόληση είναι και κάτι που δίνει και μια μεγάλη απάντηση και καλή απάντηση στην αγωνία πολλών νέων ανθρώπων για το πώς μπορεί να είναι δημιουργική στη ζωή τους.
Σας ευχαριστούμε και ευχόμαστε κάθε επιτυχία στην προώθηση του βιβλίου.
Εγώ σας ευχαριστώ.